He never imagined that the day he finally said "I do" would be the exact moment his entire life would flip upside down, inside out, and then land on a mountain of $20 billion he didn't even know existed. The sun was warm over the lake, the flowers were perfect. The arch behind them framed the glittering skyline like a painting, and Daniel stood there in his navy blue tux, palms slightly sweaty around the bouquet his bride had handed him a second earlier, thinking of nothing but their honeymoon and the quiet little apartment they would return to, completely unaware that in a few minutes he'd find out his wife was pregnant with twins and that a single signature would secretly sign away his claim to a company worth more than anything he'd ever dared to dream. Beside him, Alicia glowed in her white dress, the lace hugging her shoulders and the veil catching the breeze. But her eyes weren't as calm as her soft smile suggested, because under the dress they're babies. Yes, babies, two of them, shifted gently, and in her phone, just a few steps away on the signing table, sat the unread message from her late grandfather's lawyer explaining his will, his conditions, and the one clause that would change everything about the man she was marrying. The officiant cleared his throat. Guests rose, phones came up, and somewhere between "welcome everyone" and "who gives this woman to be married?" the camera panned over the lake, the buildings, and finally to a woman in a dark green dress, steadily walking down the side aisle, her hand resting on a very visible baby bump, her other hand clutching a sleek black folder as if it held a weapon instead of documents. Some of the guests turned their heads, whispering, because drama has a way of announcing itself silently before it explodes, and Daniel noticed her only when she stepped into the center of the aisle and stopped, eyes locked on him with something between hurt and steel. His brain flicked through faces like a mental slideshow until he recognized her, Naomi, Alicia's older sister, the one who'd always been a bit distant, a bit too busy, a bit too serious, the one who'd skipped most family gatherings and who rarely looked at him without measuring him first. The officiant stuttered, losing his rhythm as Naomi raised the folder slightly and walked forward, each step echoing through the suddenly quiet crowd, while Alicia's fingers tightened around Daniel's arm, and Daniel, confused, forced a smile, thinking maybe she was bringing some kind of surprise letter or emotional speech the family hadn't told them about. But Naomi didn't stop at the front row. She went straight up to the altar as if she owned it, her bump brushing the bouquet stand, and Daniel's best man instinctively stepped forward to ask what she was doing, only Naomi didn't even glance at him. She just opened the folder, revealing a thick document, clipped neatly inside and a crisp golden seal at the bottom. "Alicia," she said, voice steady but carrying every unsaid argument and unresolved resentment in it. "We need to talk before you sign anything." The guests gasped. The officiant glanced at the groom and bride, and someone in the back whispered, "Is this an objection?" as if this were a movie and not a real wedding about to derail. Daniel swallowed, his chest tightening, and looked from Naomi to Alicia, noticing now how pale his bride suddenly looked underneath her makeup, how she couldn't quite meet her sister's eyes, how the hand resting on her stomach moved unconsciously, protectively. "This is not the time." "Naomi," Alicia said, trying to sound firm, but her voice cracked just enough that Daniel heard the fear, and that fear crawled under his skin, because he had no idea what he was supposed to be afraid of. Was it the bump, the folder, the sister, or all of it together? "No," Naomi said, stepping closer. "This is exactly the time, because once you sign this, there's no going back, and he deserves to know what he's really signing away." And she turned the open document slightly so Daniel could see, his eyes catching the bolded number before anything else. 20,000. For a second, his mind refused to read correctly. Is that 20 million? No, there are too many zeros, 20 billion, and his heart slammed against his ribs like it wanted to escape. But he kept a shaky grin on his face, because surely this was some kind of prank, some weird distraction for the guests. Maybe a game, maybe a skit. "Naomi," Alicia hissed, "please." But her sister ignored her and continued, "Grandfather died last month, you know that. and his lawyers finalized the will yesterday. This," she tapped the document, "is the transfer of the entire company and estate to you, effective once you sign as Alicia M. Hale Weston, which you will be in about." She glanced at the officiant. 3 minutes, I'm guessing. "And according to Clause 9, Section C, your spouse forfeits any claim to management, voting rights, or equity if he signs as witness without full disclosure of the terms." Now Daniel's ears rang, not because he understood all the legal language, but because 3 words stabbed through it: spouse forfeits any claim. He blinked at the page, at the golden seal, at the neat black letters, and then at Alicia, whose lips trembled as she finally whispered, "I was going to tell you after the wedding, I swear, I didn't want this to be about money." Chaos brewed just under the surface of the crowd, phones recording, whispers rising, the bridesmaids exchanging wide-eyed looks while the lake shimmered peacefully behind them, uncaring. Daniel took a slow breath, trying to catch up with reality that had just sprinted ahead of him. His fiancée was secretly the heir to a $20 billion company. There was a document that, if he signed it blindly, would lock him out of any stake or say in that empire, and the sister he barely knew was the only one, apparently willing to blow up this fairy tale ceremony to keep him from making a fool of himself. But before he could form a coherent question, Naomi closed the folder with a soft but final click and pointed gently at Alicia's stomach. "And while we're talking about things he deserves to know, tell him about them, too." A silence fell so heavy it almost had a sound, and Daniel followed her gesture down to Alicia's midsection, noticing now what the nerves and the dress had hidden from him, a slight roundness that didn't match the girl, who'd always prided herself on her flat stomach and joked about needing to do extra sit-ups. His throat dried and he stammered, "Alicia, are you—" Tears pooled in her eyes as she nodded, placing both hands over her bump, no longer trying to hide it. "I was waiting for the right moment, Danny. I found out a few weeks ago, then the will, then the lawyers. Everything happened so fast, and I didn't know how to tell you without it sounding like I was trapping you." "Trapping me?" he repeated, feeling as if the floor under his polished shoes had turned to water. "With what exactly, Alicia?" "Twins and $20 billion. A stunned ripple of laughter and gasps moved through the guests, because sometimes the human brain doesn't know whether to cry or laugh when the numbers get that big and the stakes get that high. Alicia sniffed, nodding weakly. "Yes, twins. We're having twins, Danny." And for a brief second, everything else, the company, the contract, the cameras, fell away as an image flashed through his mind. 2 tiny faces, 2 sets of little hands, 2 babies calling him Dad. His heart lurched, flooding him with a warmth that fought fiercely against the cold shock of betrayal. And his eyes softened as he whispered, "Twins." Naomi, seeing his reaction, relaxed just a fraction, because at least that truth landed well. But she still kept the folder between them like a shield. "Look, Daniel, I'm not here to ruin your wedding. I'm here to make sure you're not tricked into signing away rights you don't even know exist. Grandfather loved Alicia, but he didn't trust anyone she married, not after what happened to Mom. So he built this clause to protect the company, to keep it in the family. Problem is, it also traps you unless you sign with full knowledge, willingly." The officiant cleared his throat and said awkwardly, "Perhaps we should pause the ceremony for a moment," and everyone exhaled, grateful for someone to acknowledge the obvious. Daniel nodded, stepping slightly away from Alicia, from the arch, from the spotlight, his hand going to his hair as he tried to process. And the camera following him made sure to capture the raw confusion on his face, perfect for a thumbnail, perfect for a viral clip. But right now, he wasn't thinking about views or likes. He was thinking about the girl he loved, who had somehow kept 2 monumental secrets from him, believing she was protecting him. He turned back to her, voice low but firm. "Why didn't you trust me enough to—" "Tell me, Alicia, did you think I'd only marry you for the money, or run away because of the babies?" She stepped toward him, veil trembling, eyes wet. "I know you love me, Danny. I do, but I grew up in a family where money ruined everything. When you told me you loved that our life would be simple, and that you were excited to build something from scratch together, I panicked. How was I supposed to say, 'Surprise, I'm actually the secret heir to Hale Weston Industries and I'm carrying your twins'? I thought if I told you before, it would change the way you looked at me, at us, at this." Naomi rolled her eyes slightly, but there was pain behind it. She's not wrong. Our parents tore each other apart over shares, board seats, lawyers. No one ever believed anyone loved anyone. They just believed in prenups and loopholes. I warned her not to hide it, but she's always believed in fairy tales more than contracts. Daniel looked between them, realizing he was standing at the intersection of two very different worlds. His ordinary, hard-working life and the billionaire legacy Alicia had tried to outrun, somewhere deep inside. The kid who grew up watching his mom struggle to pay rent whispered that walking away from 20 billion without even understanding it would be the craziest thing he'd ever done. But the man standing in a tux on his wedding day knew that trust mattered more than any number of zeros. He exhaled slowly and said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to sit down with this lawyer today, right after this ceremony or next week if we have to, and I'm going to read every word of that document. If I sign away my rights, it's going to be because I chose to, not because I was fooled into it. And as for the twins," his voice broke slightly on the word, and he smiled despite himself, "you're going to tell me everything, every doctor's visit, every craving, every fear. No more secrets, Alicia. If we're going to do this, marriage, babies, empire, whatever, we do it as a team." The guests leaned in, hanging on every word. And if you're watching this right now, you're probably leaning in too, waiting to see whether he walks away from all of it or steps deeper into a life he never saw coming. Alicia nodded repeatedly, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, I promise, no more secrets ever. I was wrong to hide it, and I'm sorry. If you want to walk away right now, I'll sign whatever you need me to sign. I just had to tell you before I said I do, even if I did it wrong." Naomi glanced at Daniel, searching his face for any sign that he might be another greedy opportunist, lining up for a slice of the family fortune. But all she saw was a man in love and completely overwhelmed, clinging to his integrity like a life raft, so she softened, closed the folder and said, "For what it's worth, Daniel, if you still choose her after this, you'll be the first man in this family who chose love with his eyes open. That matters?" The officiant, sensing a break in the tension, cleared his throat again and asked quietly, "So, do we continue, or—" Daniel looked at Alicia, then at Naomi, then at the guests, and finally back at the arch, draped in white roses, and something settled in his chest, a decision. He stepped back to Alicia, took her hands in his, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "We're going to continue, but this time with everyone knowing exactly who we are. I'm Daniel, the guy who grew up with nothing but learned to work hard. And this is Alicia, the woman I love, who happens to be pregnant with our twins and apparently the future owner of a $20 billion company. I'm not marrying her bank account, I'm marrying her, and we'll figure out the rest together." A wave of applause crashed over them, some people wiping tears, others cheering like they were at a championship game rather than a wedding. And Naomi, surprised, actually smiled. The officiant picked up where he left off. The vows that followed were shakier, more real, rooted not in fantasy but in hard truth. And when Daniel finally said, "I do," he meant it with a clarity he hadn't had an hour earlier. As they kissed, the cameras zoomed in, the perfect shot, the perfect cliffhanger. And if you want to see what happens when the honeymoon suite turns into an emergency boardroom, and how one signature threatens to destroy the trust they just rebuilt, make sure you don't just watch and scroll away. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and stay with this story, because Chapter 2 is where $20 billion stops being just a number and starts becoming a test of everything they believe about love, loyalty, and family. By the time the wedding confetti had been swept away, and the last guest had posted their favorite clip on social media. The fairy tale atmosphere had shifted into something sharper, heavier, like the air before a storm. Their first night as husband and wife didn't end with silk sheets and champagne, but with a conference table, bright white lights, and a stack of documents thick enough to stop a door. Because Naomi had insisted the lawyer meet them immediately, and Alicia had agreed, desperate to prove she was done with secrets. So there they were, Daniel in his slightly wrinkled tux, bow tie loosened, Alicia still in her wedding dress with her veil taken off, her hair pinned back messily, and Naomi in her emerald dress, tired but focused, sitting opposite Mr. Klein, the family lawyer, a silver-haired man whose eyes had seen more boardroom battles than love stories. "First," Mr. Klein said, sliding his glasses onto his nose, "let me express my condolences again for your grandfather's passing, Alicia. He was a complicated man, but he cared very deeply about this company and, in his way, about both of you." His gaze flicked between the sisters. Measuring the tension, Daniel shifted in his seat, fingers tapping the table nervously as he glanced at the cover page. Again, transfer of ownership, Hale Western Industries. The words looked unreal, like fan fiction, like something that belonged to someone else's life. Not a guy who'd been worrying about paying off his student loans. Just a few months ago, Alicia took his hand under the table and squeezed, a silent plea asking him to stay, to listen, to believe her when she said she hadn't wanted to become those rich people in the stories who let money rot their souls. "Walk me through it," Daniel said finally, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "No skip pages, no summaries. If I'm going to sign anything that affects my wife and our kids, I want to understand every single line." Naomi's brows rose slightly in approval, and Mr. Klein nodded, flipping the document open with the calm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, though rarely with a groom in a tux and a bride in a wedding gown. "The will states," Mr. Klein began, "that upon the death of Malcolm Hale, all controlling shares and voting rights of Hale Western Industries transfer to his granddaughter, Alicia Margaret Hale, provided she meets 3 conditions. 1, she must be married, believing that partnership would offer her stability. 2, she must assume the role of CEO within 6 months. And 3, her spouse must sign this secondary agreement, acknowledging that he understands he will hold no legal claim to the company's assets, management or shares, and that his role will be advisory only, with compensation set by the board if they so choose. Failure of these conditions will result in the company's control reverting to a trust managed by the board of directors, who," he paused, glancing at Naomi, "I have made it very clear they do not want the main family line involved unless forced by the will." Daniel frowned. "So let me get this straight. Alicia only gets to keep what her grandfather left her if she's married, become CEO, and I basically agree not to touch anything unless the board feels generous." "In essence, yes," Mr. Klein said. "But remember, this was not written to punish you personally. The old man never met you. It was written to prevent a repeat of what happened with Alicia's parents, the divorces, the lawsuits, the freeze-outs. He thought this would keep things clean. The spouse is either all in emotionally and free of financial motive, or they walk away before the ink dries." Alicia winced at the mention of her parents, memories flashing like shards of glass. Her mother screaming about shares, her father shouting about betrayal, lawyers stepping over emotional wreckage, as if it were just another line item to be negotiated. Daniel rubbed his jaw, weighing each word, and for a moment he felt the temptation to get angry, to storm out and declare that no man with a pen and a fortune was going to decide what kind of husband he would be. But then he looked at Alicia's face, hopeful, guilty, terrified, and he realized this wasn't just about control. It was about whether he trusted himself and her enough to stand in a world where people would assume he was a gold digger from day one. "What happens?" Daniel asked slowly. "If I don't sign?" The room went very quiet, the hum of the air conditioner suddenly loud. Naomi shifted, folding her arms, and Mr. Klein sighed. "If you don't sign, the will treats it as a failure of condition 3. Alicia will still receive a monetary inheritance, quite substantial, but not control of the company. The board takes full control through the trust, and Alicia becomes more or less a wealthy figurehead with no vote. Knowing their history with your side of the family, he added, nodding toward Naomi and Alicia, they will likely move to dilute your branch's influence as quickly as legally possible. In other words, you'd be rich but powerless, and the company would likely be steered away from your grandfather's original vision. Alicia's eyes filled again, the weight of it pressing on her chest. He wanted me to lead, Danny. I used to sit on his lap while he sat in his office chair, and he'd tell me, one day you're going to be the one signing these papers, kiddo, and you better know what they mean. I spent years running from that because I didn't want to be like my parents. But this is my chance to fix what they broke, to treat people better, to actually build something good. If you don't sign, I'll understand, I swear I will. But it means I go back to being the girl who runs from responsibility instead of stepping into it. Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers. He thought about his own parents, his father who'd disappeared when the bills got too high, his mother who'd worked 2 jobs and still managed to show up for every parent-teacher conference. He thought about how he'd promised himself he would never be the kind of man who runs when things get hard, and right now this was definitely hard. Let me ask you something else, he said, lowering his gaze to Mr. Klein again. The twins grew fast, as twins somehow do, like time was sprinting just to spite their sleep schedules. One minute they were tiny bundles swaddled in hospital blankets, and the next they were toddling around the penthouse living room with mismatched socks, sticky fingers, and an alarming talent for finding the most expensive object in the room and heading straight for it. Daniel learned to function on 3 hours of sleep, lukewarm coffee, and the kind of quiet joy that sneaks up on you when your son falls asleep on your chest mid-cry and your daughter refuses to nap anywhere except wrapped around your tie. Alicia, meanwhile, did exactly what her grandfather had predicted. She stepped into the CEO role, like she'd been training for it her whole life. But she did it with a twist, dragging the company, kicking and screaming, in some cases into a new era of ethics, transparency, and human-centered decisions. The world loved the story at first. The young pregnant CEO inheriting a $20 billion empire, the humble husband who'd signed away his claim, the twins who'd become instant memes as baby boss and mini chairwoman. But the internet's love is fickle, and as the honeymoon phase faded, the criticism came louder. Disguised as questions, was Alicia too emotional to lead, juggling babies and board meetings? Was Daniel really as selfless as he seemed, or secretly bitter? Were they strong, or were they one scandal away from collapse? The pressure built like slow thunder in the background, and it finally broke the day an internal email leaked to the press, a confidential memo from one of the older board members complaining that allowing an inexperienced heiress and her stay-at-home husband to steer a corporation of this magnitude is irresponsible and dangerous to shareholder interests. The headline twisted the wording even further. Billion-dollar board doubts, mommy CEO and house husband. Advisor inside the Hale Western Power. Struggle. Daniel saw it first. On his phone while rocking his daughter Ava to sleep, the push notification glared at him like a taunt. He read the article, jaw clenching, as the writer dissected every part of their life, questioning his masculinity and her competence with the kind of smugness only someone hiding behind a screen can manage. When Alicia came home that evening, shoulders tight from an already long day, he met her at the door, holding the printout. She glanced at the headline, rolled her eyes and forced a smile. Let me guess, they called me emotional and you useless? Pretty much, he said, trying to sound light. But there was an edge to his voice she didn't miss. She dropped her bag, stepped closer, and cupped his face. Hey, look at me. I knew there'd be a fight. They've never seen a partnership like ours before. They don't know where to put us. So they put us in boxes that make sense to them. weak husband, out-of-her-depth wife. That's not who we are. I need you to remember that, especially when they get loud. He searched her eyes, seeing the steel there, but also the exhaustion. The way she carried not just the company's weight, but the weight of proving every stereotype wrong. I know who we are, he said quietly. But I'm tired of being the punchline in every article. I'm not ashamed that I spend more time with our kids while you're in the office. I'm proud of it. He exhaled. I wish I didn't have to keep explaining it like I'm defending a crime. Alicia nodded, resting her forehead against his. Then let's stop explaining and start showing. You told me once that money and power magnify what's already there. Well, let's magnify partnership. Let's make it visible, undeniable. Come to the quarterly shareholder meeting with me next week, not as some silent shadow, but as you, the guy who reads every document, watches every trend, and knows our people better than half the board because you actually talk to them. They want to see a weakness in you, in us. Instead, let's give them a strength they don't know how to handle. He hesitated, picturing himself in that room again, filled with polished shoes, expensive watches, and decades of experience, but now with the extra spotlight of public judgment. Then he thought about the twins sleeping down the hall, and what they'd think years later watching, footage of their dad shrinking in the background or standing firmly beside their mom. The choice became clearer. Okay, he said, squaring his shoulders, let them meet me properly. The day of the shareholder meeting arrived with the usual chaos. Ava refused to eat breakfast, unless she could sit on Daniel's lap and steal his toast. Liam decided his mission in life was to hide all the car keys, and the nanny called in sick last minute with a fever. For a moment, Daniel stared at the clock, then at the twins, then at the message from Alicia, running late. Board already gathering, see you there. Proud of you. And considered calling her to say he couldn't make it. But then he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. Dress shirt crisp, tie straight, eyes determined under the fatigue. He grabbed his phone and dialed Naomi instead. Congratulations, she answered dryly. You have reached the emergency aunt helpline. How may I save your schedule today? I owe you my life if you can babysit for a few hours, he said, quickly explaining the situation. 20 minutes later, Naomi arrived, hair in a messy bun, coffee in hand, scolding Liam gently for trying to disassemble the TV remote. Go, she said, shooing Daniel toward the door. I've debated with board members who've tried to set the world on fire, too. Toddlers are nothing, and for what it's worth, show them exactly who you are. Let them underestimate you first, then make them regret it. He smiled gratefully, kissed both kids, and rushed out. The Hale Weston headquarters lobby buzzed with the polished chaos of a major corporate event, investors in tailored suits, assistants juggling tablets, photographers snapping strategic candids. When Daniel stepped inside, he felt the familiar, prickling awareness that he was both inside and outside this world, welcome because of his last name, suspect because of how he'd acquired it. The receptionist glanced up, recognized him, and smiled. Good morning, Mr. Weston. The meeting is on level 32. Mrs. Weston is already inside. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, each floor number pinging like a countdown to judgment. When the doors opened, he emerged into a hallway, lined with framed photos of Hale Weston's milestones, his grandfather-in-law, breaking ground on the first factory, ribbon cuttings, product launches. At the end of the hallway, the boardroom doors loomed heavy and imposing. He pushed them open and stepped into a room full of eyes that flicked to him, measured him, and then slid away or lingered with thinly disguised curiosity. Alicia sat at the head of the long table, calm in a charcoal blazer and white shirt. Her posture straight, hands folded. She caught his eye, and something softened in her shoulders, like his presence anchored her. There were 22 board members seated, some aligned with Alicia, others aligned with the old guard. Among them was Victor Harrell, the man whose leaked email had gone viral. His expression politely blank, but his eyes sharp. Mr. Klein sat near the end, pen in hand, ready to take notes. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Weston, Victor said, not bothering to stand, his tone cordial but clipped. I wasn't aware spouses were invited to this level of discussion. Alicia answered before Daniel could. My husband is here at my invitation as my advisor. The will doesn't forbid me from seeking counsel. And as CEO and controlling owner, I choose whose counsel I value. A small ripple moved across the table. Daniel took the empty chair beside her, feeling the weight of her public trust like a hand on his back. I'm not here to interfere, he said calmly, looking at Victor and then at the others. I'm here to listen, to understand, and to speak when my perspective might be useful. If any of you have concerns about my presence, I'd rather we address them openly than let them leak in anonymous emails later. A few heads snapped up, surprised at his directness. A younger board member coughed to hide a smile. Victor's jaw flexed barely. Fair enough, he said, then let's proceed. The meeting began with quarterly reports, numbers, charts, projections. Alicia walked them through recent changes she'd implemented. More generous employee benefits, stricter ethical sourcing, investment into sustainable technology. Profits had dipped slightly as they restructured, but long-term forecasts showed potential for higher growth. Still, some members focused on the short-term dip like vultures circling a wound. With all due respect, Mrs. Weston, one older member named Harold said, her fingers steepled, your idealism is admirable. But shareholders are nervous. They see a young CEO balancing nappies and net profit, and they worry about stability. The press has already latched onto this family soap opera narrative. Sentiment moves markets. Alicia nodded, unbothered on the surface, but Daniel felt her foot tap once under the table, a tiny tell of irritation. I understand the concern, she replied, but sentiment also favors companies that treat people well. Our retention rates are up. Our recruitment pool has widened, and we've avoided 2 potential PR crises because we had the moral infrastructure in place to respond quickly. The market isn't blind to that. Victor leaned forward, and yet the market is also not blind to risk. And what they see right now is a CEO whose husband, by his own admission, has no stake in the company and could walk away tomorrow without losing a cent. If we're discussing stability, we have to address the elephant in the room. What happens when personal conflicts at home bleed into corporate decisions? No offense, Mr. Weston, but you did sign away any legal responsibility. It's easy to be noble when you have nothing to lose. The words stung, not because they were fully true, but because they hit a tender place Daniel still wrestled with at night. He could feel the eyes on him again, waiting to see if he'd get angry, shrink, or stammer. Instead, he took a breath, remembered the twins' tiny hands wrapped around his fingers, remembered the promises he'd made to himself, to Alicia, to them, and spoke, keeping his voice calm but firm. You're right about one thing. Mr. Harrell, he said, I did sign away my legal claim. I don't own any part of this company on paper, but that doesn't mean I have nothing to lose. My wife is at this table, the mother of my children. The future we're building is tied to the decisions made in this room. If this company fails because the board clings to outdated power structures and refuses to adapt, my family suffers financially, emotionally, reputationally. I might not have stock certificates framed on my wall, but my stake is very real. I have skin in the game through the people I love, and that's a lot harder to cash out on than shares. A few board members shifted, some nodding slightly. Alicia watched him, pride flickering in her eyes. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel continued. And since we're talking about risk, let's talk honestly. You're not really afraid that I'll walk away and leave Alicia with this company. You're afraid that I won't walk away, that I'll stay, that I'll stand beside her, that together we'll have the emotional backbone to actually change things, even when you'd prefer we stayed quiet and grateful. Because if I were the stereotype some of you expected, the shallow guy chasing her money, I'd be easier to control. You could throw me a board seat, a title, a bigger paycheck, and I'd bend. But I've already signed away the leverage you think I'd want. I can't be bought into silence, and I'm not here to play the game you're used to. The room went still. Even the hum of the AC seemed to pause. For a moment, Daniel worried he'd overstepped. But then a younger member, Sophia, the head of digital strategy, spoke up. Actually, I've seen firsthand how their partnership works. I've been in meetings where Alicia left to take a call from the pediatrician, and Daniel seamlessly picked up the conversation, summarizing her position better than any of us. Whether or not he has shares, he understands the vision, and frankly, I'd rather have a CEO supported by a strong partner than one hiding a messy personal life that explodes into scandal later. Harold raised a brow. Still, this blending of personal and professional makes some of us uneasy. Alicia finally interjected, her voice steady. Then get used to being uneasy. I won't apologize for being a mother and a CEO, or for trusting my husband. This company was built by a man who treated it like a kingdom he had to control. I intend to run it like a community we are responsible for. That means you will see my life and my values show up in our decisions. If that bothers you, you're free to sell your shares and invest in someone whose personal life is hidden, but whose actions you can't predict. It was a line in the sand, and everyone in the room knew it. Silence stretched, not hostile this time, but heavy with recalibration, as people mentally reorganized where they placed her on their respect scale. Victor sat back, lips pressed together, recognizing that pushing harder right then would make him look worse, not better. Very well, he said eventually. Let's move on to the vote regarding your proposed restructuring of the executive compensation packages. The rest of the meeting was intense, but surprisingly productive. Daniel stayed mostly quiet, speaking only when he had something specific to add, an observation about employee morale from the internal surveys he'd read, a question about long-term brand perception. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted from suspicion to reluctant engagement, as more members realized he wasn't there to grandstand but to help Alicia see the whole board, not just the pieces her critics wanted her to focus on. When the meeting finally adjourned, people stood, gathered their papers, and made small talk. Victor approached Daniel and Alicia, his expression guarded but less hostile. I still think your situation is unconventional, he said, but I can't deny your conviction. That speech will play well in the press if it gets out. We didn't say it for the press, Daniel replied. We said it because it's true. But if it leaks, we're not going to hide from it. Victor nodded grudgingly. Just remember, markets don't care about love stories. They care about numbers. Alicia smiled calmly. Then we'll give them both. That night, after they'd picked up the twins from Naomi's apartment, where Auntie had somehow taught them to high-five and say boardroom in a hilarious little chorus, they finally collapsed on their own couch, kids asleep in their cribs, the city lights glowing through the windows. Daniel loosened his tie and sighed deeply. I feel like I just went 12 rounds with capitalism itself. Alicia laughed, curling up against him. You were incredible today. I knew you'd be good, but you surprised even me. He shook his head. I almost bailed this morning. If Naomi hadn't shown up, I would have called and said I couldn't make it. She looked up at him, eyebrows raised. Really? He nodded. Yeah. And on the way there, I kept hearing all those comments. The ones online. The ones between the lines in that boardroom. And I realized something. They only have as much power as we give them. They don't live in this apartment. They don't change these diapers. They don't wake up at 3 a.m. when Liam decides sleep is a myth. We do, and that gives us the right to define our own success, not let them define it for us. Alicia smiled softly. You know what scares me sometimes? Not the money, not the company. It's how much I care about doing this right. Not just for me or for Granddad's legacy, but for them. She nodded toward the twins' room. I don't want our kids to grow up seeing their parents broken by the same things that broke their grandparents. Daniel wrapped an arm around her. That's exactly why we're going to keep doing the uncomfortable thing, showing up together. If love doesn't walk into the boardroom will walk into our home and try to rewrite what love is. I'm not letting that happen. Over the next year, their unusual partnership became less of a scandal and more of a case study. Business schools started asking Alicia to guest lecture on integrating family values into corporate leadership, and journalists, once obsessed with the guy who signed away 20Bs began writing pieces with headlines like redefining power inside the marriage-steering Hale Weston's new era. Not everyone was convinced, of course. Skeptics still waited for the moment it all crumbled, for a fight caught on camera, for proof that a man couldn't possibly handle his wife being the bigger earner, or that a woman couldn't possibly balance board reports with bedtime. But that day never came, not because they were perfect, but because when the arguments did happen, they weren't about money or control, they were about ordinary things. Like who forgot to buy diapers or who left the presentation notes in the car. Every time they circled back to the same promise. No secrets, no power games, just messy, honest partnership. One evening, as they prepared for a family interview requested by a major financial magazine, the twins ran laps around the living room, wearing tiny suits Naomi had bought them for brand consistency. The interviewer asked Daniel, "Be honest, do you ever regret signing that contract? Do you ever wish you'd negotiated some shares, some official role, something more visible?" Daniel thought about it, not for the camera, but truly, deeply, searching his own heart. Then he smiled, glancing at Alicia, who stood a few steps away trying to coax Ava out from behind a chair with promises of cookies. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. That contract forced me to ask myself who I am, without a price tag attached. It made our marriage start from a place of clarity. No pretending, no wondering. I know she didn't marry me for my money, and she knows I didn't marry her for hers. We built everything on top of that. And honestly, the most valuable seat in this empire isn't at the head of the table. It's right where I am, next to her, raising our children to understand that the real inheritance we're giving them is a model of what partnership can look like when ego gets out of the way." The interviewer scribbled notes furiously, eyes bright, already seeing the headline. Later, when the article came out and the video of that answer clipped its way across social media, something shifted again in the public's perception. Comments poured in from men who admitted they'd been scared of their partners, success from women who said they'd never seen their own ambitions reflected in a relationship so clearly, from couples who started talking about their money, their roles, their dreams more honestly after watching. Their story escaped the narrow world of business news and became something else, a mirror, a challenge, an invitation. And if you're still here, still watching, you probably feel it too, that tug to rethink what power, love and success mean in your own life. As the twins turned 3, the company stabilized under Alicia's leadership. Profits rose, employees reported higher satisfaction, and Hale Weston's name began to appear on most ethical companies' lists. The old guard on the board either adapted or quietly retired, replaced by people who understood the new vision. Daniel found his rhythm, balancing freelance consulting work with his parenting and advisory roles, carving out an identity that wasn't shadowed by insecurity but grounded in choice. One quiet night, after the kids finally went down, without staging a full-scale protest, he and Alicia sat on the balcony, city lights stretching like a river of stars below. She leaned against him, head on his shoulder, and asked, "If you could go back to that day at the wedding, when Naomi walked down the aisle with that folder and everything exploded, would you still do it? Would you still say yes to me, yes to them, yes to this?" He looked out over the skyline, remembering the shock, the fear, the weight of that pen in his hand. Then he turned to her, brushed a stray curl from her forehead, and said softly, "I wouldn't just say yes. I'd say it louder. I'd tell everyone there and everyone watching online that this was the best risk I ever took. Not because of the company, not because of the billions, but because it forced me to grow into the kind of man who can stand beside a powerful woman without needing to cut her down to feel tall. Loving you, choosing this, made me stronger, not smaller." Her eyes shimmered, reflecting both the city lights and something brighter. "And I'd choose you again, even if there was no company. No money, no grand story, just us. And 2 babies who won't sleep through the night." They laughed, and the sound was softer than the cheers of shareholders, but deeper, more real. "If you've made it all the way to this point, you're not just a casual viewer. You're part of this journey now. You've walked down that chaotic wedding aisle, sat through the tense board meetings, paced the hospital hallway, and stood on this balcony with them. So don't let this be just another story you scroll past and forget. Hit that subscribe button, tap the like, and drop a comment telling us what this story made you think about your relationships, your dreams, your fears about money and power. Because as Daniel and Alicia keep writing the next chapters of their life, raising the twins, facing new challenges, building a legacy that's about more than numbers, you'll want to be here for it, growing alongside them. And who knows, maybe the next big twist, the next brave decision, the next $20 billion moment is waiting just around the corner. And you'll be right here with us when it happens.